O tihe, uri uri tihe, nako nako katauha, ka whakatauha, te rangi e tū nei katauha, ka whakatauha, te papa e takoto nei katauha, ka whakatauha, te mātuku mai rarotanga. Ui aruku hi a mana wapau rato, ui aruku hi a mana wapau, waho whakatina kia tina te more i Hawaiki. He pupu ana hoki e wawau ana hoki tāre watu ki te rangi. Tēnā kia eke. Eke panuku, eke tangaroa, hara mai te toki. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. What has colonization taught us about ourselves as Indigenous people? In this episode, we will look at some of the colonial narratives around Māori identity, how these narratives and associated imagery are communicated to us as a colonized people who are living in a colonial settler state, and what function this narrative serves in upholding colonization. Engari, before we do this, we must remember that prior to colonization, identity was centered on whakapapa, the defining feature that connects tāngata to each other, to the past, the future, and to the living environment of which we are a part of. This is important to know because it allows us to see the difference between the colonial identity that has been created for us by colonization and how our tupuna viewed themselves. This also provides us with a whāinga, a goal, or a tauira, an example, to aspire to as we decolonize ourselves. As discussed in the last 2 episodes, the process of colonization creates an unequal power dynamic. It creates the colonizer and the colonized, the oppressor and the oppressed. The process of colonization is the subjugation of one people by another to gain control of natural resources like land, minerals and precious metals, water, and labor. Once the initial stages of colonization, like military invasion, theft of land, and the establishing of the colony, have achieved their goal, colonization then requires a social narrative to be put in place to maintain the colony and its power. This social narrative is a colonial narrative and is perpetuated by those living in the colony to uphold the validity of the colony being in place. It is designed to maintain the unequal power dynamic between the colonizer and the colonized, and is utilized across a wide variety of sites in the colonial structure, such as education, the media, politics, and through interpersonal relationships and communication, which are invariably the outcome of the first 3. This colonial narrative focuses on invalidating the identity of the colonized person as an Indigenous person, which it does using a number of different ways. Firstly, it utilizes negative stereotypes created by the colonizer, which is built on racism. These negative stereotypes work to minimize or denigrate the abilities of the colonized person, thus reaffirming that the unequal power dynamic created by colonization between the colonizer and the colonized is a natural or correct outcome, rather than one of subjugation, whereby the colonizer, through their natural superiority, has succeeded, while the colonized has not. If we examine the images of ourselves that we are constantly shown through the media, whether it be in print media like the newspaper or on television, they are overwhelmingly negative. Shows like Police 10/7 serve to uphold the narrative that we are lawbreakers, violent, and antisocial. Although this show has recently been critiqued and is being reviewed, it is important to remember the length of time, that this show has been on air, the generations that have watched it, and the effect that this has had on tāngata Māori and our perception of ourselves. Furthermore, this colonial narrative serves to highlight that any imbalance in colonial society between the colonizer and the colonized is due to the innate flaws of the colonized. Māori are lazy, Māori are on the dole, Māori are unemployable. These types of stereotypes function as a means to deny the cause of social inequity as being connected to colonization, and instead infer that it is due to the innate negative qualities of the colonized person that inequity occurs. Secondly, it creates derogatory terms that invalidate the tangata as an indigenous person. Plastic Māori, half-caste. These sorts of terms infer a standard that all colonized people must attain in order to be considered a real tāngata Māori, while ignoring the fact that any disconnect between colonized people and their indigenous culture is an intended outcome of colonization. These terms create a false standard of cultural or ethnic purity that indigenous people must conform to before they are considered valid in the eyes of the colonizer. It is important to look critically at these sorts of derogatory terms and consider what purpose they serve. For example, if we are all plastic Māori, then there are no longer any real Māori left in Aotearoa. And if there are no real Māori left, then the colony and the colonizers are not responsible for addressing the way in which the colony was founded, and the subsequent inequity for indigenous people created by this process. If the indigenous people no longer consider themselves indigenous, who is the colony accountable to in terms of the damage caused by colonization? Who will hold the colonizer accountable for the past, present, and future if there are no indigenous people, only people who live and maintain the colony? This colonial narrative aids in effectively absorbing or assimilating us into the colonial culture, the outcome of which is that we no longer have a valid culture as indigenous people that connects to our indigenous ways of doing and being. Instead, we belong to a colonial culture that includes some aspects of our own culture. However, this inclusion is at the behest of the colonizer, who holds the power to include and exclude. Once assimilated, we no longer have any claim to or status as indigenous people, which in turn enables the process of colonization to continue and for the colony to be maintained. It also attempts to remove our ability to critique and push back against the process of colonization, or to fight to regain our taonga which were lost as a result of colonization. Therefore, when we use these terms as colonized people to invalidate other tāngata Māori in their identity, we are neglecting to remember that we are upholding the colonizer's narrative and thus invalidating not only our own whanaunga, but ourselves. This is key when looking critically at our own actions. When we call ourselves or each other half-caste, plastic, or part Māori, who is that serving? What is it upholding? And what is the utu for us as a people? Lastly, this colonial narrative aims to invalidate indigenous knowledge and history through a colonially constructed hierarchy of knowledge. This is maintained through Pākehā education system and is also utilized in politics and the media to undermine and invalidate claims to the contrary by Indigenous people. For example, many generations educated in Pākehā schools were taught that Captain Cook navigated here, while our tūpuna's arrival was built on a myth of fishing up an island, and thus we must have drifted here by mistake. Thus, this hierarchy serves to invalidate Indigenous ways of doing and being, of Indigenous science, knowledge, and technology, all of which were used to maintain our whakapapa prior to colonization. This hierarchy ignores the perspective and the history of the colonized people and teaches us the narrative that colonization was good and equal. It also provides a false perspective that the colonial state that we live in was the natural outcome of things, and thus creates a standard of normal that privileges the culture, language, and knowledge of the colonizer over that of the colonized. This narrative teaches us as Indigenous people to disregard our own mātauranga and to pursue that which is of worth, namely colonial knowledge. This impacts on how we see ourselves as Indigenous people, and often causes us to not only try to obtain the colonizer's knowledge, but also to aspire to be like the colonizer in our identity and in our ways of doing and being. All the above serve to change how we see ourselves, our identity as tāngata Māori. It attempts to tell us that we are better off assimilated into the colonizer's identity, which is built around the false narrative of there being one people in the colony. This colonial narrative of one people is false because it ignores the greater context in which this one people exists, a context that has been created by colonization. Furthermore, this narrative denies the existence of an unequal power dynamic between the colonized, Indigenous people, and the colonial settlers who are privileged by the colonial structure. This privileging of the colonizer is imperative to maintaining of power by the colonial structure, as it relies on the colonial settlers to physically occupy the land while upholding a narrative which denies the validity of tāngata Māori as Indigenous people who were disposed of the land and resources required to build the colony. This colonial identity is interwoven into the colonial narrative because it serves to uphold the validity of the colony in its position of power, and thus its subjugation of the Indigenous people. He oi anō e te iwi. Knowing this, and remembering that colonization has affected us all to varying degrees, what do we see when we look at ourselves as tāngata Māori? Do we see our identity as whakapapa, as descendants of tūpuna who navigated between islands utilizing science to traverse bodies of water, to adapt and thrive in new environments using this same science while creating philosophy, ideologies, expressions of culture like art and song? Communities built on collectivism, caring for kaumātua, kuia, and tamariki? Or through our thinking, our beliefs, and our actions, do we perpetuate the narrative about us as tāngata Māori that has been set by colonization?